Chapter 7 Part 5 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 1, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7 The Winter Journey, Part 5. There was no doubt that we were in the devil of a mess, and it was not altogether our fault. We had had to put our igloo more or less where we could get rocks with which to build it. Very naturally we had given both our tent and igloo all the shelter we could from the full force of the wind, and now it seemed we were in danger not because they were in the wind, but because they were not sufficiently in it. The main force of the hurricane, deflected by the ridge behind, fled over our heads and appeared to form by suction a vacuum below. Our tent had either been sucked upwards into this, or had been blown away because some of it was in the wind while some of it was not. The roof of our igloo was being wrenched upwards and then dropped back with great crashes. The drift was spouting in, not it seemed because it was blown in from outside, but because it was sucked in from within. The lee, not the weather wall, was the worst. Already everything was 6 or 8 inches under snow. Very soon we began to be alarmed about the igloo. For some time the heavy snow blocks we had heaved up on to the canvas roof kept it weighted down, but it seemed that they were being gradually moved off by the hurricane. The tension became well nigh unendurable. The waiting in all that welter of noise was maddening. Minute after minute, hour after hour, those snow blocks were off now anyway, and the roof was smashed up and down. No canvas ever made could stand it indefinitely. We got a meal that Saturday morning, our last for a very long time as it happened. Oil being of such importance to us, we tried to use the blubber stove, but after several preliminary spasms it came to pieces in our hands, some solder having melted, and a very good thing too, I thought, for it was more dangerous than useful. We finished cooking our meal on the primus. 2 bits of the cooker having been blown away, we had to balance it on the primus as best we could. We then settled that in view of the shortage of oil we would not have another meal for as long as possible. As a matter of fact, God settled that for us. We did all we could to stop up the places where the drift was coming in, plugging the holes with our socks, mitts and other clothing, but it was no real good. Our igloo was vacuum, which was filling itself up as soon as possible, and when snow was not coming in, a fine black moraine dust took its place, covering us and everything. For 24 hours we waited for the roof to go. Things were so bad now that we dared not unlash the door. Many hours ago Bill had told us that if the roof went he considered that our best chance would be to roll over in our sleeping bags until we were lying on the openings and get frozen and drifted in. Gradually the situation got more desperate. The distance between the taut sucked canvas and the sledge on which it should have been resting became greater, and this must have been due to the stretching of the canvas itself and the loss of the snow blocks on the top. It was not drawing out of the walls. The crashes as it dropped and banged out again were louder. There was more snow coming through the walls, though all our loose mitts, socks and smaller clothing were stuffed into the worst places. Our pyjama jackets were stuffed between the roof and the rocks over the door. The rocks were lifting and shaking here till we thought they would fall. We talked by shouting, and long before this one of us proposed to try and get the alpine rope lashed down over the roof from outside, but Bowers said it was an absolute impossibility in that wind. "You could never ask men at sea to try such a thing," he said. He was up and out of his bag continually, stopping up holes, pressing against bits of roof to try and prevent the flapping and so forth. He was magnificent. And then it went. Birdie was over by the door, where the canvas, which was bent over the lintel board, was working worse than anywhere else. Bill was practically out of his bag, pressing against some part with a long stick of some kind. I don't know what I was doing, but I was half out and half in my bag. The top of the door opened in little slits, and that green Willesden canvas flapped into hundreds of little fragments in fewer seconds than it takes to read this. The uproar of it all was indescribable. Even above the savage thunder of that great wind on the mountain came the lash of the canvas as it was whipped to tiny little strips. The highest rocks which we had built into our walls fell upon us, and a sheet of drift came in. Birdie dived for his sleeping bag and eventually got in together with a terrible lot of drift. Bill also, but he was better off. I was already half into mine and all right, so I turned to help Bill. "Get into your own," he shouted, and when I continued to try and help him he leaned over until his mouth was against my ear. "Please, Cherry," he said, and his voice was terribly anxious. I know he felt responsible, feared it was he who had brought us to this ghastly end. The next I knew was Bowers' head across Bill's body. "We're all right," he yelled, and we answered in the affirmative. Despite the fact that we knew we only said so because we knew we were all wrong, this statement was helpful. Then we turned our bags over as far as possible so that the bottom of the bag was uppermost and the flaps were more or less beneath us. And we lay and thought, and sometimes we sang. "I suppose," wrote Wilson, "we were all revolving plans to get back without a tent, and the one thing we had left was the floor cloth upon which we were actually lying." Of course we could not speak at present, but later, after the blizzard had stopped, we discussed the possibility of digging a hole in the snow each night and covering it over with the floor cloth. I do not think we had any idea that we could really get back in those temperatures in our present state of ice by such means, but no one ever hinted at such a thing. Birdie and Bill sang quite a lot of songs and hymns, snatches of which reached me every now and then, and I chimed in, somewhat feebly I suspect. Of course we were getting pretty badly drifted up. "I was resolved to keep warm," wrote Bowers, "and beneath my débris covering I paddled my feet and sang all the songs and hymns I knew to pass the time. I could occasionally thump Bill, and as he still moved I knew he was alive all right. What a birthday for him!" Birdie was more drifted up than we, but at times we all had to hummock ourselves up to heave the snow off our bags. By opening the flaps of our bags we could get small pinches of soft drift which we pressed together and put into our mouths to melt. When our hands warmed up again we got some more, so we did not get very thirsty. A few ribbons of canvas still remained in the wall over our heads, and these produced volleys of cracks like pistol shots, hour after hour. The canvas never drew out from the walls, not an inch. The wind made just the same noise as an express train running fast through a tunnel if you have both the windows down. I can well believe that neither of my companions gave up hope for an instant. They must have been frightened, but they were never disturbed. As for me, I never had any hope at all, and when the roof went I felt that this was the end. What else could I think? We had spent days in reaching this place through the darkness and cold such as had never been experienced by human beings. We had been out for 4 weeks under conditions in which no man had existed previously for more than a few days, if that. During this time we had seldom slept except from sheer physical exhaustion, as men sleep on the rack, and every minute of it we had been fighting for the bedrock necessaries of bare existence, and always in the dark. We had kept ourselves going by enormous care of our feet and hands and bodies, by burning oil, and by having plenty of hot fatty food. Now we had no tent, 1 tin of oil left out of 6, and only part of our cooker. When we were lucky and not too cold we could almost wring water from our clothes, and directly we got out of our sleeping bags we were frozen into solid sheets of armoured ice. In cold temperatures, with all the advantages of a tent over our heads, we were already taking more than an hour of fierce struggling and cramp to get into our sleeping bags, so frozen were they, and so long did it take us to thaw our way in. No, without the tent we were dead men. And there seemed not one chance in a million that we should ever see our tent again. We were 900 feet up on the mountain side, and the wind blew about as hard as a wind can blow straight out to sea. First there was a steep slope, so hard that a pick made little impression upon it, so slippery that if you started down in finnesko you could never stop. This ended in a great ice cliff, some hundreds of feet high, and then came miles of pressure ridges, crevassed and tumbled, in which you might as well look for a daisy as a tent, and after that the open sea. The chances, however, were that the tent had just been taken up in the air and dropped somewhere in the sea, well on the way to New Zealand. Obviously the tent was gone. Face to face with real death, one does not think of things that torment the bad people in the tracts and fill the good people with bliss. I might have speculated on my chances of going to heaven, but candidly I did not care. I could not have wept if I had tried. I had no wish to review the evils of my past, but the past did seem to have been a bit wasted. The road to hell may be paved with good intentions. The road to heaven is paved with lost opportunities. I wanted those years over again. What fun I would have with them! What glorious fun! It was a pity. Well has the Persian said that when we come to die we, remembering that God is merciful, will gnaw our elbows with remorse for thinking of things we have not done for the fear of the day of judgment. And I wanted peaches and syrup badly. We had them at the hut, sweeter and more luscious than you can imagine, and we had been without sugar for a month. Yes, especially the syrup. Thus impiously I set out to die, making up my mind that I was not going to try and keep warm, that it might not take too long, and thinking I would try and get some morphia from the medical case if it got very bad. Not a bit heroic, and entirely true. Yes, comfortable warm reader, men do not fear death, they fear the pain of dying. And then quite naturally, and no doubt disappointingly to those who would like to read of my last agonies, for who would not give pleasure by his death, I fell asleep. I expect the temperature was pretty high during this great blizzard, and anything near zero was very high to us. That and the snow which drifted over us made a pleasant wet kind of snipe marsh inside our sleeping bags, and I'm sure we all dozed a good bit. There was so much to worry about that there was not the least use in worrying, and we were so very tired. We were hungry, for the last meal we had had was in the morning of the day before, but hunger was not very pressing. And so we lay, wet and quite fairly warm, hour after hour, while the wind roared around us, blowing storm force continually and rising in the gusts to something indescribable. Storm force is force 11, and force 12 is the biggest wind which can be logged. Bowers logged it at force 11, but he was always so afraid of overestimating that he was inclined to underrate. I think it was blowing a full hurricane. Sometimes awake, sometimes dozing, we had not a very uncomfortable time so far as I can remember. I knew that parties which had come to Cape Crozier in the spring had experienced blizzards which lasted 8 or 10 days, but this did not worry us as much as I think it did Bill. I was numb. I vaguely called to mind that Peary had survived a blizzard in the open, but wasn't that in the summer? It was in the early morning of Saturday, July 22nd, that we discovered the loss of the tent. Some time during that morning we had had our last meal. The roof went about noon on Sunday, and we had had no meal in the interval because our supply of oil was so low, nor could we move out of our bags except as a last necessity. By Sunday night we had been without a meal for some 36 hours. The rocks which fell upon us when the roof went did no damage, and though we could not get out of our bags to move them, we could fit ourselves into them without difficulty. More serious was the drift which began to pile up all round and over us. It helped to keep us warm, of course, but at the same time in these comparatively high temperatures it saturated our bags even worse than they were before. If we did not find the tent, and its recovery would be a miracle, these bags and the floor cloth of the tent on which we were lying were all we had in that fight back across the Barrier, which could, I suppose, have only had one end. Meanwhile we had to wait. It was nearly 70 miles home, and it had taken us the best part of 3 weeks to come. In our less miserable moments we tried to think out ways of getting back, but I do not remember very much about that time. Sunday morning faded into Sunday afternoon, into Sunday night, into Monday morning. Till then the blizzard had raged with monstrous fury. The winds of the world were there, and they had all gone mad. We had bad winds at Cape Evans this year, and we had far worse the next winter when the open water was at our doors, but I have never heard or felt or seen a wind like this. I wondered why it did not carry away the earth. In the early hours of Monday there was an occasional hint of a lull. Ordinarily, in a big winter blizzard, when you have lived for several days and nights with that turmoil in your ears, the lulls are more trying than the noise. The feel of not to feel it. I do not remember noticing that now. 7 or 8 more hours passed, and though it was still blowing we could make ourselves heard to one another without great difficulty. It was 2 days and 2 nights since we had had a meal. We decided to get out of our bags and make a search for the tent. We did so, bitterly cold and utterly miserable, though I do not think any of us showed it. In the darkness we could see very little and no trace whatever of the tent. We returned against the wind, nursing our faces and hands, and settled that we must try and cook a meal somehow. We managed about the weirdest meal eaten north or south. We got the floor cloth wedged under our bags, then got into our bags and drew the floor cloth over our heads. Between us we got the primus alight somehow, and by hand we balanced the cooker on top of it, minus the 2 members which had been blown away. The flame flickered in the draughts. Very slowly the snow in the cooker melted. We threw in a plentiful supply of pemmican, and the smell of it was better than anything on earth. In time we got both tea and pemmican, which was full of hairs from our bags, penguin feathers, dirt and débris, but delicious. The blubber left in the cooker got burnt and gave the tea a burnt taste. None of us ever forgot that meal. I enjoyed it as much as such a meal could be enjoyed, and that burnt taste will always bring back the memory. It was still dark and we lay down in our bags again, but soon a little glow of light began to come up, and we turned out to have a further search for the tent. Birdie went off before Bill and me. Clumsily I dragged my eiderdown out of my bag on my feet, all sopping wet. It was impossible to get it back, and I let it freeze. It was soon just like a rock. The sky to the south was as black and sinister as it could possibly be. It looked as though the blizzard would be on us again at any moment. I followed Bill down the slope. We could find nothing, but as we searched we heard a shout somewhere below and to the right. We got on a slope, slipped and went sliding down, quite unable to stop ourselves, and came upon Birdie with the tent, the outer lining still on the bamboos. Our lives had been taken away and given back to us. We were so thankful we said nothing. The tent must have been gripped up into the air, shutting as it rose. The bamboos, with the inner lining lashed to them, had entangled the outer cover, and the whole went up together like a shut umbrella. This was our salvation. If it had opened in the air, nothing could have prevented its destruction. As it was, with all the accumulated ice upon it, it must have weighed best part of 100 pounds. It had been dropped about half a mile away, at the bottom of a steep slope, and it fell into a hollow, still shut up. The main force of the wind had passed over it, and there it was, with the bamboos and fastenings wrenched and strained, and the ends of 2 of the poles broken, but the silk untorn. If that tent went again, we were going with it. We made our way back up the slope with it, carrying it solemnly and reverently, precious as though it was something not quite of the earth. And we dug it in as a tent was never dug in before, not by the igloo but in the old place farther down where we had first arrived. And while Bill was doing this, Birdie and I went back to the igloo and dug and scratched and shook away the drift inside until we had found nearly all our gear. It is wonderful how little we lost when the roof went. Most of our gear was hung on the sledge, which was part of the roof, or was packed into holes of the hut to try and make it drift-proof, and the things must have been blown inwards into the bottom of the hut by the wind from the south and the backdraft from the north. Then they were all drifted up. Of course a certain number of mitts and socks were blown away and lost, but the only important things were Bill's fur mitts, which were stuffed into a hole in the rocks of the hut. We loaded up the sledge and pushed it down the slope. I don't know how Birdie was feeling, but I felt so weak that it was the greatest labour. The blizzard looked right on top of us. We had another meal, and we wanted it, and as the good hoosh ran down into our feet and hands, and up into our cheeks and ears and brains, we discussed what we would do next. Birdie was all for another go at the Emperor penguins. Dear Birdie, he never would admit that he was beaten. I don't know that he ever really was. I think he, Wilson, thought he had landed us in a bad corner, and was determined to go straight home, though I was for one other tap at the rookery. However, I had placed myself under his orders for this trip voluntarily, and so we started the next day for home. There could really be no common sense doubt we had to go back, and we were already very doubtful whether we should ever manage to get into our sleeping bags in very low temperature, so ghastly they had become. I don't know when it was, but I remember walking down that slope, I don't know why, perhaps to try and find the bottom of the cooker, and thinking that there was nothing on earth that a man under such circumstances would not give for a good warm sleep. He would give everything he possessed. He would give how many years of his life? 1 or 2 at any rate. Perhaps 5. Yes, I would give 5. I remember the sastrugi, the view of the knoll, the dim, hazy black smudge of the sea far away below, the tiny bits of green canvas that twittered in the wind on the surface of the snow, the cold misery of it all, and the weakness which was biting into my heart. For days Birdie had been urging me to use his eiderdown lining, his beautiful dry bag of the finest down, which he had never slipped into his own fur bag. I had refused. I felt that I should be a beast to take it. We packed the tank ready for a start back in the morning, and turned in utterly worn out. It was only -12° that night, but my left big toe was frostbitten in my bag, which I was trying to use without an eiderdown lining, and my bag was always too big for me. It must have taken several hours to get it back by beating one foot against the other. When we got up as soon as we could, as we did every night, for our bags were nearly impossible, it was blowing fairly hard and looking like blizzing. We had a lot to do, 2 or 3 hours' work, packing sledges and making a depôt of what we did not want in a corner of the igloo. We left the second sledge and a note tied to the handle of the pickaxe. We started down the slope in a wind which was rising all the time and -15°. My job was to balance the sledge behind. I was so utterly done I don't believe I could have pulled effectively. Birdie was much the strongest of us. The strain and want of sleep was getting me in the neck, and Bill looked very bad. At the bottom we turned our faces to the Barrier, our backs to the penguins, but after doing about a mile it looked so threatening in the south that we camped in a big wind, our hands going one after the other. We had nothing but the hardest wind-swept sastrugi, and it was a long business. There was only the smallest amount of drift, and we were afraid the icy snow blocks would chafe the tent. Birdie lashed the full biscuit tin to the door to prevent its flapping, and also got what he called the tent downhaul round the cap, and then tied it about himself outside his bag. If the tent went, he was going too. I was feeling as if I should crack, and accepted Birdie's eiderdown. It was wonderfully self-sacrificing of him, more than I can write. I felt a brute to take it, but I was getting useless unless I got some sleep, which my big bag would not allow. Bill and Birdie kept on telling me to do less, that I was doing more than my share of the work, but I think that I was getting more and more weak. Birdie kept wonderfully strong. He slept most of the night. The difficulty for him was to get into his bag without going to sleep. He kept the meteorological log untiringly, but some of these nights he had to give it up for the time because he could not keep awake. He used to fall asleep with his pannikin in his hand and let it fall, and sometimes he had the primus. Bill's bag was getting hopeless. It was really too small for an eiderdown and was splitting all over the place, long great holes. He never consciously slept for nights. He did sleep a bit, for we heard him. Except for this night and the next, when Birdie's eiderdown was still fairly dry, I never consciously slept, except that I used to wake for 5 or 6 nights running with the same nightmare, that we were drifted up and that Bill and Birdie were passing the gear into my bag, cutting it open to do so, or some other variation. I did not know that I had been asleep at all. "We had hardly reached the pit," wrote Bowers, "when a furious wind came on again and we had to camp. All that night the tent flapped like noise of musketry, owing to 2 poles having been broken at the ends and the fit spoilt. I thought it would end matters by going all together, and lashed it down as much as I could, attaching the apex to a line round my own bag. The wind abated after 1½ days, and we set out, doing 5 or 6 miles before we found ourselves among the crevasses. We had plugged ahead all that day (July 26) in a terrible light, blundering in among pressure and up on to the slopes of Terra. The temperature dropped from -21° to -45°. Several times we stepped into rotten lidded crevasses in smooth wind-swept ice. We continued, however, feeling our way along by keeping always off hard ice slopes and on the crustier, deeper snow which characterizes the hollows of the pressure ridges, which I believed we had once more fouled in the dark. We had no light and no landmarks to guide us, except vague and indistinct silhouetted slopes ahead, which were always altering and whose distance and character it was impossible to judge. We never knew whether we were approaching a steep slope at close quarters or a long slope of Terror miles away, and eventually we travelled on by the ear, and by the feel of the snow under our feet, for both the sound and touch told one much of the chances of crevasses or of safe going. We continued thus in the dark in the hope that we were at any rate in the right direction. And then we camped after getting into a bunch of crevasses completely lost. Bill said, "At any rate I think we are well clear of the pressure," but there were pressure pops all night, as though some one was whacking an empty tub. End of chapter 7, part 5.